We are going to continue our review of AP World History as we get ready for the exam with a Unit 1 topic, the developments in the Americas. So we're going to look at um, some of the civilizations that emerged in the Americas. Again, the history of both North and South America are very rich, certainly extending much earlier than the time that we're covering in our AP World History class. But certainly, I want to give you some background just so we can understand what was happening. And we're really in a unique situation because until we have European arrival in the Americas in 1492, we have two worlds existing simultaneously. We have the developments that are occurring in Afro Eurasia, which we've been discussing, and then we have the developments occurring in the Americas. Both civilizations have similarities and, of course, differences, but agriculture and trade is something that's consistent among both regions, as among all the regions that we've discussed so far. But really, during this time period in the Americas, following the decline of the Olmecs and Middle America and the Chavan in the Andes, new civilizations such as the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incas rose in those same regions. We also know there's a rich Native American culture in North America as well. So, just as we saw in Afro Eurasia, several of these civilizations developed strong states with large urban centers and complex uh, belief systems. And our understanding of these civilizations is relatively limited because it's based only on archaeological evidence and what we've been able to discover, literally dig up and make assumptions about oral traditions that have defined these cultures, because by and large, there wasn't a culture or tradition of written history as we've seen in some other civilizations. And then, of course, European accounts, which we know are going to be slightly skewed. More than slightly skewed, but they're going to be biased. So it's important when we think about sourcing, when we look at documentation, think about the perspectives and point of views of the author and how that might cloud our understanding of whatever topic the author is writing about. So, because of these things, that's going to limit our understanding in many ways of these civilizations and cultures. But the first large scale civilization in North America emerged in the 7 to 800s CE in what is now the eastern United States. So, since it started in the Mississippi River Valley, it is known as the Mississippian culture. While other cultures built monumental buildings, Mississippians are known for their enormous earthen mounds, some of which could be as tall as 100 feet and cover the area of what would be the equivalent of 12 football fields. And the Mississippian society had a very rigid class structure. A chief called the Great Sun ruled in each large town. And then below the Great Sun was an upper class of priests and nobles, a lower class of farmers, hunters, merchants, and artisans. And again, that reflects a lot of what we see in Afro Eurasian civilizations. At the bottom were slaves who were usually prisoners of war. And in general, women farmed and men hunted. So you did see some gender roles there. But the Mississippians had a matrilineal society. So that meant that social standing was determined by the woman's side of the family, which was somewhat different from what we've seen previously. The Mississippian culture declined mainly. One theory suggests that it was environmental factors. In both cases, these are environmental factors, but no, there's no historian consensus on this. One theory suggests that it's flooding or extremes in weather led to crop failures and basically a collapse of the agricultural economy that was needed to support these large cities that emerged. But of course, we know that by uh, 1600, the Mississippian cities have essentially been abandoned, and that is occurring around the same time of the introduction of Europeans and diseases like smallpox that just decimated Native American populations. Some other North American civilizations to note, just for our review. Soon after the rise of the Mississippian civilization, these cultures emerged in what is now the southwestern United States. So both the Chaco and Mesa Verde civilizations lived in dry regions. They developed ways to collect, transport, and store water efficiently. And then, in addition, because the climate, trees were small and scarce. So they couldn't use wood to build their homes. So the Chaco, as you see here on uh, your left, built large housing structures using stone and clay. And some of these included hundreds of rooms. And you can see a little bit of that in the footprint of that building there. And then the Mesa Verde built multi story homes into the sides of cliffs using bricks made out of sandstone. And then again, our knowledge of these civilizations is limited because we don't have a lot of historical documentation. Most of what we have is just archaeological evidence. But we do know that by the late 13th century, as the climate became drier, both of these civilizations were in decline. But the important point to note is that civilization was not just suddenly sprung and brought to North America by the Europeans with the arrival of Columbus. It is something that had had a rich history in the Americas. Unfortunately, because of that European arrival, much of that history has been lost. These are probably a little bit more familiar to you. Moving on farther south to Central America and South America, um, Mayan civilization reached its height between 250 and 900 CE. So you see in the green, we have the Maya city states, and then in the orange is the Aztecs, both in modern day Mexico. Um, Basically, what is now part of Mexico and then what is now Belize, Honduras, and Guatemala. Most lived in or near one of the approximately 40 cities in the Mayan civilization, and these cities range in size from 500 to 50,000 people. And at its peak, we think as many as 2 million people lived in the Mayan civilization. So, a little more detail about the Maya. Um, the main form of government, as I mentioned, was a city state. So, each of these city states were ruled by a king. It had a city and its surrounding territory. Most rulers were men, as far as we know. However, oftentimes, if there was no male heir or the male heir was not old enough to govern, a woman would step in and rule. Wars between city states were very common, um, and at times, city states were overthrown. No one city state ruled the entire territory, but just by their very nature, because of the differences in size and structure, some city states tended to wield more authority than others. And very rarely, though, did Mayans fight to control territory, which is why we don't really see the civilization expand as we see in some of the Afro Eurasian empires and civilizations that we've been discussing. More often, they fought to gain tribute, which are payments from conqueror to the conqueror, and we see tributes as well in Afro Eurasia. And captives were often used as human sacrifice during religious ceremonies because religion was a very important part of the civilization. Each Mayan king claimed to be descended from a god. So the Mayans believed that when the king died, he would become one with his ancestor god. And then the king, so we see a social structure here. The king directed the activities of the elite scribes and priests who administered the affairs of the state. So it's almost very similar to a bureaucratic system that we would see in ancient China. Royal rule usually passed from father to son, but sometimes if a king lost the support of their people, they would be overthrown. And the common people were required to pay taxes, but usually in the form of crops or in the form of labor to government. It's also interesting that none of the city states had a standing army. So when conflict did emerge, people were often conscripted or drafted or called into service. We also know that Mayans have kind of become a important part of pop culture, especially with all of the 2012 discussion and issue about the end of the world and the calendar. But we do know that they were innovative thinkers and inventors. They were they had a complex writing system, right? They perfected mathematics, especially in terms of weights and measures and figuring out those kinds of things for trade. The use of the number zero uh, was incorporated. Zero was incorporated into the number system again as part of this accounting for trade. And then they also learned how to make rubber out of liquid collected from the rubber plants. So all of this emerging separately from the technologies we see in Afro-Eurasia. Mayan science and religion were linked through astronomy. Again, we saw astronomy played an important role in Islam. Um, Based on the calendar, priests would decide when to celebrate religious ceremonies, whether to go to war. So that's why keeping an accurate calendar was very important. And even though they had no telescopes, they were able to make very precise observatories atop pyramids, such as the one at Chichen Itza, which the image that we've all seen. So their observations enabled priests to design a calendar that was even more accurate than what was being used in Europe at the time. One of the tasks of priests was, which priests could be either male or female, was to conduct ceremonies that honored many deities. They were polytheistic. And among the most important deities were those of the sun, rain, and maize or corn. So Mayans made offerings to the gods so that prayers might be answered. And as I mentioned, war captives could sometimes be killed as offerings in a human sacrifice. Which brings us to the Aztecs, who are probably more known for human sacrifice, although a lot of that could be European embellishment than the Maya are, but also located in Central America. They're also known as the Mexicas, were originally hunter gatherers, and they'd migrated to central Mexico from the north in around the 1200 CE. By 1325, they founded their capital at Tenochtitlan, which is the site of what is now Mexico City. And if you remember talking about the engineering marvel that is Tenochtitlan. It's built on a lake. Part of that is a defensive measure, um, connecting the civilization around the central hub. Um, it grew to almost 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at this time. And to provide water for the city, they built a network of aqueducts, as you see here on the map. And then at the center of the city, as you see in the model pictured, they built a pyramid that rose 150 feet in the air. And that Great Pyramid and other pyramids, temples were made of stone. And on Lake Texcoco, the Aztecs built floating gardens to increase the amount of space for food production. So likely some of these pyramids could have been used for storage. And they also dug ditches to use the lake water to irrigate their fields and then drain parts of the lake for more arable and farmable land. Now, we also know that as Aztecs conquered much of Mesoamerica, they developed a tribute system also that ensured that their dominance throughout the region would be maintained. Conquered people were forced to pay tribute, surrender lands, and or perform military service. And tribute could include anything from practical goods such as food, cloth, firewood, or luxury items like feathers, beads, and jewelry. So those were the type of currency, for lack of a better term, in these civilizations. There wasn't really a common means of exchange. The Aztecs allowed local rulers to stay in their positions to serve as tribute collectors. And again, that's something that we see mirrored in Afro Eurasia. And this allowed the Aztecs to build political dominance without direct administrative control. That's what makes it easier to manage an empire of that size. Again, something else we see replicated in the way that the Mongols structure their civilization. But again, these two worlds don't know each other even exist. And to administer the empire, the Aztecs grouped city states into provinces. And so they moved warriors and their families to each province's capital to make sure that the province remained under Aztec control. So that's a distinction from the Maya, where each city state yielded a little more or wielded a little more independence. And an Aztec official was even stationed in each capital to ensure that collection of tribute, which kept the empire going. The Aztec civilization was the government in the Aztec civilization was theocratic, which meant it was ruled by religious leaders. So the top, you had an emperor known as the Great Speaker, and he was both the political ruler and the divine representative of the gods. And then again, you have this hierarchy, this social hierarchy, this structure, another one of our continuities in world history. You had the landowning nobles, who also formed a majority of the Aztec military leadership. And then you have the scribes and the healers. And then you have the craftspeople and traders. And one of the differences when we talk about our comparisons among some of these civilizations is how do they feel about the craftspeople and traders, where sometimes you see some flexibility in the civilizations that place them higher as compared to others. So, for example, in ancient China, the merchants and traders would hold a lower position than in some of the Islamic empires that we've discussed or we will be discussing. There was a special merchant class called the Pochteca, which traded in luxury goods, and below the traders were the peasants and the soldiers. So Aztecs also had a system of slavery, which usually would be punishment for not paying your debts or punishment for crime, certainly not necessarily a race based system of slavery. Remember, racial distinctions will come when the Europeans arise, particularly in Central America, as we will discuss in later units. And religion, just as with the Maya, was an intricate and complex to their lives. And they were polytheistic, like the Mayans were. They worshiped hundreds of deities. Many were male and female or anything in between. And it involved many great rituals and feast days, as well as human sacrifices. The Aztecs believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves in order to create the world. And so, therefore, they concluded that human sacrifice and bloodletting was sort of a repayment, an atonement for human sin. Now, we also suspect, and again, this is speculation because our understanding of this history is very limited, that human sacrifice probably had a political component in the sense that it demonstrated the great might of the Aztec Empire over the individual. And we don't know for sure the number of human sacrifices. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that could be an exaggeration based upon the accounts of Spanish invaders to justify some of the atrocities that we see against the Aztec people. As far as women are concerned, we know that they did play an important role in the tribute system because they wove the valuable cloth that would be accepted as part of a tribute payment. And In fact, in order to keep up with the demand of the tribute, a husband might obtain more than one wife in order to pay the tribute. Most Aztec women, from our understanding, worked in their homes, but we also know that some became priestesses, midwives, healers, merchants, um, and played other roles in society. And there were even some noble women who were scribes to female members of the royal family, suggesting that there was education available, at least learning to read and write, for females. Although, unfortunately, like the most civilizations we've talked about in this time period, um, the Aztec Empire uh, declined by the 15th century. Now, historians will point and say, well, they had a low level of technology, didn't have wheeled vehicles, they didn't have pack animals, agriculture was difficult for those reasons. Um, the human sacrifice made it difficult to govern. Um, Tribute was only sustainable for so long. But ultimately, I mean, the the arrival of the Spaniards in 1519 uh, took advantage of a lot of these internal weaknesses and made it easier for Hernan Cortez and the other conquistadors just to steamroll their way through the Aztec civilization. Another thing that we'll see in this region, which then brings us to the Inca. So the Inca Empire emerges around 1438, and it's through a series of military victories. They take these regions that are ruled by small tribes and form a full fledged empire, the Inca Empire. So it extends from present day Ecuador, all the way in the north to Chile, all the way in the south. So a lot of focus early on with consolidating power and making sure that the region was as united as possible, notwithstanding some of the geography that it would face. Now, in order to rule, though, this extensive territory efficiently, the Inca Empire was split into four provinces, each with its own governor and its own bureaucracy. Again, a theme that we will see also in Afro Eurasian, and we have seen that. Conquered leaders who demonstrated loyalty to the empire were rewarded. So it created this system of fidelity and loyalty to the emperor. And in contrast to the Aztecs, conquered people under the Inca did not have to pay tribute. So instead of a tribute system, they had the Midas system, which was mandatory public service. So this required men between the ages of 15 and 50 to provide agriculture and other forms of labor, including, and this becomes key to keeping this empire together, the construction of roads. The Inca were known as people of the sun, um, and Inti, the sun god, was the most important of the Incan gods. They were polytheistic, like the other civilizations we've talked about. But Inca rulers were considered to be Inti's representative on Earth. And so, as the center of true critical elements in Incan religion, honoring the sun and royal ancestor veneration, the Temple of the Sun in Cusco was really the core of their religion. Royal ancestor veneration, as I've mentioned here, was a practice intended to extend the ruler of a leader. So dead rulers were mummified and continued to rule as they had in life and were thought to retain ownership of their servants, possessions, and even their property. So Inca rulers could not expect and did not expect to inherit land or property upon assuming power. And this is one of the reasons why Inca civilization expands in the way it does, because there's only so much land, right? And if you can't inherit land, if you retain land on into death, then where else are you going to go? You have to expand to gain land. As we discussed with the Maya, priests were consulted before important actions. So to the Inca, the gods controlled all things, and the priest could determine the god's will by studying the arrangements of cocoa leaves in a dish, or even watching the movements of a spider. You had priests do things like diagnose illnesses, predict the outcome of battles. You even had them solving crimes, um, determining what sacrifices should be made to what god. So serious events, such as famines, plagues, defeat in war, oftentimes would result in human sacrifice, but certainly not to the same frequency as we saw with the Aztecs. And we also know that Inca religion involved some animism, which is, if you remember, again, this is review. Animism is the belief that elements of the physical world could have supernatural powers. So this could be something like large geographical features, like a river or a mountain peak, or it could be something as small as a stone or a plant, or it could even be a built object like a bridge. So really changes the way that the Inca uh, form relationships with and impact their environment. As far as achievements go, mathematics was probably one of the biggest areas of impact for the Inca Empire. They developed the quipu, which was a system of knotted strings that was used to record numerical information. Again, just as we saw with the Maya for trade and for engineering. It recorded messages to be carried throughout the empire. Again, that's how they kept consolidated power among such a large empire. In agriculture, just because of their geography, they had to develop a sophisticated terrace system for the cultivation of crops because really they're literally on the side of a mountain range. Um, Potatoes and maize being some of the main crops that they would grow. And then the terraces also included some raised beds with channels that would capture and redirect rainwater to avoid erosion during floods and help them get through dry periods in case there were ebbs and flows to the climate. And the Inca, though, were especially good builders of bridges and roads. So, using that Midas system, they constructed a massive roadway system called the Carpa Nan, which was included some 25,000 miles of roads. It's about half of what the United States interstate system is today. And those roads were usually mainly used by the government and the military. And in mountainous regions, bridges provided a pivotal role of keeping the empire united and connected as well. The ultimate downfall and decline of the Inca came in 1532 with the arrival of Francisco Pizarro, another Spanish conquistador. The empire was already in the midst of a civil war and some internal conflict, and that just created an environment for Pizarro to come in and divide and conquer and take advantage of, combined with, as we've seen in the other civilizations, the negative impact of European diseases. So again, we'll end with kind of this comparison here. Historians have always debated how closely Mesoamerican cultures are related to each other. Uh, some argue that most are based on the Olmec civilization, since many later cultures adopted some of its same features. So, for example, the Olmec's feathered snake god became fundamental in both the Mayan and the Aztec religion. Um, the subjects depicted in Olmec pottery have been found in pottery in other civilizations. So, again, our understanding is relatively limited of this time period just because we don't have a lot to work with. But it is important to note when we think about the emergence of civilization during this time that as much as we emphasize Afro-Eurasian, we will when we talk about trade and cultural interactions until we get to European arrival in the Americas, that there were vibrant civilizations and cultures uh, being shaped, developed, and emerging, and coming up with innovations in their own right over in the Americas. Unfortunately, the reason why it's not a big focus in world history is just because there's not much history there anymore to examine. So that brings us to our end of this developments in the Americas. If you have any questions, reach out to me. But we will move on to talking about developments in Africa for Unit 1. Take care.